Thank you so much for your patience. God forbid if this happens again, I will have to send an old video. All right, but hopefully it's rectified now. It's powered back on. So I apologize. I have your names, so you'll get credit regardless. But at any rate, moving on to number one. I'm making the argument, right? Kind of court history fashion, that this war was worth fighting. It was a just reason for us to go to war against fascism and its coercive dissemination throughout the world for nothing less than, I know it sounds very hyperbolic, like I'm exaggerating strategically, but for nothing less than world domination, these fascist countries. Moving back to Germany, Germany in the Treaty of Versailles was to give up 1/8 of its land, 1/10 of its population, maintain a 100,000 man army, pay war reparations as a part of the war guilt clause for World War I, have the uh, parts of those of the territories, right, of the 8%, went to new countries to be entitled to their right of self-determination. So the Sudetenland of many Germans, for instance, went to the new country of Czechoslovakia. The port of Danzig went to the new and renewed country of Poland, as examples. And then the Rhineland to the west was to be occupied by an international army. And under Adolf Hitler, ever since 1933, when they, or 32, when they acquired 33% of the parliamentary votes, which was not a majority, but it was a plurality, with the most seats elected, the German National Socialists or Nazis were able to have one of their own to be the prime minister, who was known as the chancellor at that time. And then, of course, Paul von Hindenburg dies uh, after Hitler had become chancellor, and the Reichstag is lit on fire, and there was fighting in the streets with communists, and Hitler declared the Enabling Act to make himself a 6-month dictator. And of course, that stretched into much longer than 6 months. They banned all political parties except for their own. They took over the press and did not acknowledge freedom thereof of the press, of course, and no dissent was tolerated. They began the Hindenburg Laws to identify Jewish people who were at least 1/8 Jewish to wear the Star of David and to be segregated into ghetto areas of the major cities. And of course, that was just the beginning of the Holocaust. They also um, began to put undesirables into the euphemism was labor camps. And yes, they were labor camps, but they also tried to kill them as well as utilizing labor. As we know full well, when we liberated these concentration camps like Auschwitz and Dachau, they put undesirables some were religious figures who stood up to the Nazis. Some were homeless. Some were homosexuals. Um, they even wanted to sterilize. They moved to sterilize the handicapped. Okay, in trying to, in the name of eugenics, bring about a master race of Aryan Germans. So, in addition to that, they uh, they defied one facet of the. Let me try to share this again. They tried to defy one facet of the Versailles Treaty after another. He raised more than 100,000 man army and marched into the Rhineland. The international army that was to occupy it stepped down in fear and evacuated. And then he was not allowed to have an annexation of Austria, and he did it anyway, known as the Anschluss. And he contended that the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia was filled with Germans, and he was going to take it back. And then after that, right, he demanded all of the new nation state of Czechoslovakia. Then he started making overtures that he was going to invade Poland for the port of Danzig. And the British in particular were trying to appease him because there was widespread belief that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair in its punitive fashion toward the Germans. But now he'd gone too far, according to global opinion. And so appeasing him didn't seem to work. So they gave him an ultimatum, and he defied that ultimatum. And on September 1st, 1939, he invaded Poland. And we know that he'll quickly take Poland. He'll go up into the Scandinavian countries and take Norway, and I believe Sweden, and as well as Denmark. And I don't know how early on, but he was already planning not only to surround and come back in southward to defeat France, but also to use those bases, those Scandinavian bases, for his future invasion of Russia as well, right? Despite his non-aggression pact with Stalin. And so it's very easy to see how the Japanese and the Germans played the bully in World War II. Okay. Japan, with her naked aggression, and China just stepped out of the League of Nations. And so, but then you look internally, right? And you see the idea of self-government and self-determination, the idea of codifying classical liberalism that entails the autonomy and the complete freedom of the individual under Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. It constituted more than just a cry against imperialism of one stronger country invading a weaker country, right? It also entailed the assertion that no military tyrant and no autocrat should rule in any country, that the League of Nations should unite and have that dictator overthrown, and in the name of the freedom and the rights of their people that they have subjugated to them. And that's where you get into the danger of fascism domestically, right? Wherever it was planted. So with fascism, right, there is this mystical idea that everyone, like functional theory, everyone is one body part of the whole body politic. Okay. So if you're laborers, perhaps agricultural laborers or proletariat workers in the factories, you might be considered metaphorically the legs of society, right? But it's very clear that the leading party are the head and the brains of the outfit, and they get to dictate policy without checks and balances, without organized opposition, at least legally recognized organized opposition, and so forth. So there was this mystical belief, right, that under these fascist countries, that these leaders had the charisma, had the wisdom to know what the special destiny and direction of their people, their nation was. And there was no question in it. So, of course, you have Adolf Hitler, the Führer, the leader. You have Il Duce, the leader, Mussolini in Italy. And then, although on paper you have not Hideki Tojo, you have Emperor Hirohito, a lot of people believe with his personality and his youth, he was a bit of almost a puppet of Hideki Tojo, who led the military party of Japan. So at any rate, there was no contending against them. Dissent, individuality were not tolerated, all right, in these fascist countries. And again, no checks and balances to prevent tyranny, no oppositional parties, and elections to decide who wins, none of that, all right? And then also they were for brute force. A lot of them had been influenced by the writings that we had gone over with overseas imperialism in the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century. So you might recall some of those beliefs, like social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and only the societies that are adaptive, technologically, adaptive culturally, adaptive politically, um, adaptive economically, and militarily are going to prevail. And it's a survival of the fittest fight. You had Malthus, right, and his idea that there's only a finite amount of resources and civilizations are going to be duking it out for those scarce resources. That is just a matter of time. Chamberlain and Gobineau said that different races were going to be fighting it out for those scarce resources. You had Friedrich Nietzsche, and Friedrich Nietzsche played on other writers who had theories about people having a barbaric and dynamic rise as a society when they're very quite uncivilized, very militaristic, and they end up prevailing. But then they get too sophisticated. They become decadent. They become too comfortable and too lazy and too soft. And then they lose their hegemony, their domination to a new barbaric group that comes up. So, to Friedrich Nietzsche, he said that, representative democracy, like with a parliament, was too weak and was a sign of that decadence and softness of Europe, that they were not sufficiently militaristic, they were not sufficiently imperialistic in taking over others' lands, etc. And they needed to return to their primal roots. All right. And so, those ideas were largely incorporated by the leadership in Japan and certainly in Germany, as well as Italy. And so that's scary stuff, right? That is very inimical to what Western civilization has held dearly ever since the 1740s with the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, the movement in the early 1800s for classical liberalism and individuality. These are very much contrary to those beliefs that we hold dearly, and we have some of which are codified in our Constitution and in our law and traditions here in the U.S. So the argument can go, right, is that fascism is inherently inimical. It's dangerous to what we hold dearly in Western civilization, and it's being spread by force. And so it had to be fought. All right. Let's see here. And then, of course, how much more when you get involved in the Holocaust. Right. Then what I did on number two, this is also court history, is I deflect, right? I deflect and say, look how awful the Japanese fought as far as their treatment of non-combatants. Okay. Non-combatant is anyone who's not in the formal capacity wearing a uniform, fighting you and armed on the battlefield. So it could be a prisoner of war who has surrendered. It could be civilians who have never been drafted to fight. You could find example after example in this book called Unjust Enrichment, Japanese violations of notions of just war doctrine, of notions of international law that were violated again and again by the Japanese armed forces. All right. I mean, look at this stat alone. To compare the fates of American prisoners held in two major theaters of war from 41 to 45, nearly 40%, 40, of U.S. military prisoners died in Japanese captivity, while just over 1% of American prisoners of war died in Nazi hands. That's quite a discrepancy. All right. So 9 out of 10 prisoners who died in World War II perished while under Japanese custody. So I give examples of such. The Red Cross, they were adamant in prisoner exchanges. And the Japanese said, no, no, we're going to exchange prisoners as circumstances dictate. We're going to keep the latitude of choosing if and when we exchange prisoners. And of course, right, you could exaggerate this, but there is some truth to the fact that ever since the Meiji Restoration, there was a movement that was quite nostalgically tied back to the Tokugawa period, the age of the daimyo and the samurai. And in it, right, there really was kind of an ethos that said death before dishonor, that you fight to the death. You do not ever, if you are a soldier worth your salt, you don't ever surrender to the enemy. You die on the field instead. All right. So at any rate, they didn't have respect culturally and institutionally for prisoners of war. They thought they were cowards and they'd relinquished their right to life by surrendering. So you have the Bataan Death March in the Philippines after Japan took the Philippines from the United States. And it says here, right, 5,000 of not quite 20,000 American prisoners of war perished amidst a 65-mile march across the peninsula. All right. So you see this in old movies and so forth and documentaries. If you were wounded and you moved too slowly and you fell by the wayside, they would bayonet you and kill you right there on the spot as a prisoner of war. And what they also did, right, and in some cases they just came in and butchered people trying to surrender. And then even in the cases where they quite admired the courage and bravery of American or other soldiers, Allied soldiers, they at times would behead them. Um, and it was supposed to be an act of honor that they were worthy of dying in such manner, like the samurai of old. And so Wake Island, Americans fought very, very valiantly until they ran out of ammunition and received no reinforcements. And so the Marines were finally captured and they were beheaded on Wake Island. You also have, and it went both ways, right? I think of Saipan. In Saipan, the Japanese people were told that the Americans would eat their children and just engage in these just worse than death atrocities to the Japanese civilian people. So you had masses of people diving off cliffs, throwing their babies off cliffs at Saipan when the United States prevailed militarily, so that they would not fall into the hands of American soldiers. But that was the culture, that was the leadership of the Japanese military party at this time. All right. The Marus Maru, American POWs found themselves in the water, and the only ship that they could come aboard was a Japanese one, and many of them were hacked to pieces trying to climb up onto the Japanese ship. And the list goes on in her book of instances such as these. All right. Then another thing that they did, right, which was against international law, is they enslaved Allied prisoners of war, and they forced them to work for the Zaibatsu. The Zaibatsu were the Japanese firms or corporations that had military contracts with the Japanese armed forces. Okay. And so they would force them to work in their fields. They'd force them to work, many of them in their factories. The famous Burma Railroad in Myanmar was built by the enslaved labor of Allied prisoners of war. All right. And of course, they were not paid. They were basically enslaved. All right. And then in a couple other places where there's the primary source record of them really abusing civilians in places that they were supposed to, on paper, be liberating from the Western powers, right? And one can be found in the Philippines. In the Philippines, they used the euphemism comfort women to grab any young women, and some were prepubescent, grab some of the women and take them sexually. Um, They they performed the old Roman decimation quite often as well. They would line up Allied prisoners of war and they would kill the 10th person just almost arbitrarily right then and there on the spot to instill fear and forever other supposed reasons. And yeah, so the list goes on and on of awful things. And then, of course, right, the rape of Nanking in China. If you look that up, if you Google that, you will be just aghast at the number of civilians that they killed quite arbitrarily. And you see here, I mean, it's an awful picture. They would even use some of them as bayonet practice. Okay. So when we fought on certain small island chains, when we engaged in the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, we had to start from the very bottom, Australia and New Zealand, um, and fight our way up, back up into the Philippines, back up into Indonesia, into Southeast Asia, and then, of course, ultimately surround the main Japanese islands. It was very costly in men. It was very time consuming. It absorbed a lot of resources uh, to such an extent that people might argue that we won as a war of attrition. We outlasted the Japanese. Um, but at any rate, when you look at certain islands that were quite small, but had tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers on them, that is what is going to be used as the supportive data by the new president, because FDR will die in his fourth term of natural causes, cited by Harry Truman. All right. So if you wanted to look up a couple islands where it was quite costly to gain very little ground on a small island. I personally subjectively think of Peleliu, Pelieu, I think. And I hope I spelled that correctly. It's very close to that, if that's not it. Peleliu and also Tarawa, Tarawa. One of them, right? I kid you not, was like 2.5 miles wide, 14 miles long, and they stuffed 40,000 Japanese soldiers on it. And they did the stats of how much ammunition, how many American casualties were incurred for literally every square step of that small island. And that's where they came to the conclusion that the Japanese under their current administration was so fanatical in fighting to the death that we needed something to psychologically shock them. So hence we allegedly needed to drop the hydrogen and plutonium bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right. So at any rate, and that's very argumentative. We're going to get further into that pretty soon. Did we fight in a just manner? Now I'm taking a revisionist turn, right? And saying, well, I'm not sure about that. You know, for one, right? They played games with lives. Uh, they knew they had reason to believe that we may have cracked their code, right? It was Operation Magic, the whole, like with the Enigma machine and the Code Purple and so forth with the carried out with the Nazi Germany. We likewise cracked the code of the Japanese, and we didn't want them to know that. So when it looked like we were continually anticipating their every move, they considered changing their code. And we certainly didn't want that because it had taken us so long to decipher it. So then our leaders decided not to warn our troops on a few subsequent attacks to make it look more innocent, as if we had no clue when and where the Japanese were going to strike. And it did work to the extent that Japan did not change its code. And that ultimately did help us. But in a way, you're playing God with soldiers and deciding who you're going to warn and who you're not going to warn of an impending Japanese attack. Um, we also, in fighting the war, through our Secretary of State office, there was a guy named Breckinridge Long, who had very ample evidence of the concentration camps killing their inhabitants, and hence the Holocaust. And we did nothing. We sat on that information. We were asked to just simply hit railroad tracks on their way to the concentration camps to disrupt the readily available supply, right, of detainees on their way to their deaths. And we wouldn't even do that. Our administration said, first and foremost, we have to win the war, and then in that process, we'll free the people in these concentration camps. So we didn't make it a high instance, a high priority, the Holocaust, that is. All right. And then also, because remember, uh, in Nova Scotia, our leader, our executive, Franklin Roosevelt, met with Churchill, and they instituted a series of declarations declaring why we were the good guys, why fascism was so inherently dangerous and evil, and why it had to be stopped. Okay, known as the Atlantic Charter. And we didn't necessarily follow that because one of them was that you believe in the dignity and the worth of every human individual. Um, we had at Schweinfurt in Germany, we had bombers that we used as decoys, were willing to sacrifice their lives to try to get the famous Luftwaffe up into the air, because only when they were up at a certain altitude could our 51 Mustangs take care of them. So yes, it did work as far as a means to an end. Our P-51 Mustangs uh, inflicted quite a bit of damage to the Luftwaffe, but at the expense of some of these bombers and these slow, cumbersome bombers that were meant to just decoy them up into the air. All right. And some of the bombers knew that they were being used as such and went AWOL. All right. So we did that as well. Um, then also fire and incendiary bombing and bombing of civilian targets. That certainly does not go in line with just war doctrine, and we did just that. All right. Now, granted, in the books that I've read, the British were ahead of us on that. And remember, though, in the Battle of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, right, where the Nazis were going to invade England, they bombed the heck out of British cities and killed, I don't remember how many thousands of English civilians. So Churchill, and then you get into Churchill's personality, he was known as the British Bulldog. He had no problem, no qualms with retaliating in kind. And supposedly um, it took some negotiation and some time for American commanders to be okay with this, for us to carry it out, as well as England and Germany. But they did. They eventually did. Now, they tried to rationalize it by a point system. Um, if a given city or area had war munition factories, that was worth so many points. If it had telecommunications to send communications out to the front and back to the soldiers, that was worth so many points, etc. And so supposedly, a given region or town or city had to merit a certain number of points before we were willing to hit it. But we broke our word in some instances and bombed civilian targets that did not merit intervention by our own point system. All right. So, and then you have Dresden. in Germany. Supposedly our guys had to, because the anti-aircraft technology of the Germans was so adept and dangerous, they felt compelled, the Americans, to attack German cities at night. And when they did, right, at Dresden, they couldn't see. It was like kind of in the midst of kind of a storm. And so they dropped incendiaries to drop upon the buildings and the ground to light up the targets so they could hit them. But instead, the incendiaries caused a great fire in Dresden that killed thousands of German civilians. All right. And then also just think of the war munition factories in Berlin and Bonn, et cetera, in Tokyo, getting hit, right? Imagine our outrage if the Nazi in fascist countries had done that to us. As you might know, the East Bay here in California was an integral part of the war-making machine in present-day Oakland, in Richmond, okay? And a lot of people came into those areas, a lot of American migrants, all the way from the South to get jobs, riveting airplane wings, welding, and doing other uh, type tasks to build our war machine. So imagine if they bombed Richmond and Oakland, and of course that didn't happen. But I think there's plenty of evidence that we would have been not mortified, we would have been just indignant over that. But that's exactly what we did to them. All right. So we hit civilian targets. And then sadly, ultimately, Hiroshima, right? Hiroshima did not merit getting hit on the point system. It just didn't. And matter of fact, there are, and I apologize, I used to have a key individual, his name memorized, and I no longer do. But there have been primary source quotes from men in the closed confines of these secret meetings who said they precisely wanted to hit Hiroshima because it was pristine, it was untouched, and they wanted to show the deadly power of this new bomb. All right. And then with the bomb, right? I find it interesting how many of the leaders behind making the bomb were refugees from Nazi Europe. It's quite amazing. And I don't necessarily mean Jewish, but people that were kind of far on the left, sympathetic to the Jews, and had to get out of there. Um, and so that's quite amazing. But to show the type of moral dilemma that they were facing, right, is there was a Danish scientist named Niels Bohr, and Niels Bohr was looked up to tremendously by Oppenheimer, who was in charge of the bomb, right, in New Mexico, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the Sangre de Cristo mountain chain, hidden in New Mexico. They created a town there, right? And they bring all these scientists and intellectuals there to learn how to properly split the right type of atoms and create energy from such. And he was constantly, in a biography that I've read of Oppenheimer, trying to pick the brain of Niels Bohr, who had been his professor back in Europe. And Niels Bohr would just give these subtle hints, and then that's it. And he'd stop himself because he had a problem with using his brain to devise a weapon of mass destruction. He had an ethical issue with it. So by the time this bomb was dropped, right, some of the scientists got together and did a petition. And in the petition, they said they asked that Japan be brought to a certain neutral venue and see a sample of this bomb. before we just drop it on a Japanese city. Invite them, make them watch this bomb before it kills somebody. They also said that there should be a governing board of scientists who have equal power with the U.S. military and government in deciding when and how and if to use um, an atomic bomb. And of course, that didn't happen, but they tried anyway to petition for such. Oppenheimer himself went a little crazy. Not only was there early Cold War signs of espionage and infiltration from the Soviet Union, um, and then the American government's kind of anti-terrorist infringements upon First and Fourth Amendment rights of Americans there at Los Alamos, trying to see if they had any treacherous members of the fifth column, people here in the U.S. that are going to sell the secrets to the Russians, etc. You might be familiar with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who will be found convicted as guilty of such and be uh, executed. You had a guy named Chevalier, and there was a case with him as well of possible espionage. And so Oppenheimer was watched constantly and had like a mental breakdown more than once over all this stress, which included stress over actually using it against a civilian population. He did have moral qualms with that. But the military and President Truman took over. They cited island conquests like Peleliu and Tarawa, and supposedly, arguing of how costly an American invasion would be of the, what is it, 3 to 5 main Japanese islands. And they said this is a better alternative to save American casualties, psychologically shock Japan and Tojo and his military party. And also, let's face it, as we get into the next subject, there also is evidence that Truman wanted to scare the Soviet Union and show them our new toy. So God only knows the reasons for which we dropped these two bombs. And, when we drop one August 6th on Hiroshima, and we only give them 2 days to process it, and then on the 9th, we drop a second one on Nagasaki that was even more powerful. So, people said that we could have done a naval quarantine around the Japanese islands. There are other, alternatives some people would say, to just dropping these bombs on them. All right. So at any rate, the manner by which we fought became rather vicious in some ways, rather calculated, rather kind of Machiavellian, right? Doing whatever it takes ruthlessly to win. And so it's something to think about. But again, also, and lastly, in the Pacific Islands, it is true that our boys contend that the Japanese did it first, and who knows what the truth is. But they began killing and mutilating the bodies of American soldiers that they had killed and that had surrendered to them. And so the Americans began responding in kind. I remember one case, I don't mean to be gross, but there was a case of an American found and his genitals had been cut off and stuffed into his mouth. And the Americans became so angry that the first Japanese prisoner that they were able to catch, they cut his teeth out of his mouth. All right. And so you have racism involved in this for sure. Look at the official propaganda just from the government itself, calling them the sneaky Japs, etc., and their depictions of the Japanese. So then number 4, I said, were we really fighting for the right reasons? And I leave that in doubt. Okay. Because if we were, as stated the Atlantic Charter, trying to fight for the dignity and the basic human rights of every individual, Why do we still have Jim Crow laws in the South against African Americans? Why do we still have Jim Crow in the West against Mexican Americans? Segregated theaters, segregated parks, segregated swimming pools, segregated schools, you name it. There was housing segregation, whereby realtors signed contracts that they would not sell or rent property in certain neighborhoods to Latinos. Okay. Then also there were the case of Mexican Americans being thrown into harm's way. All right. Um, you have the case of the Rapido River in Italy. A lot of them were from San Antonio, Texas, and a lot of them were Hispanic. And they were made to cross the Rapido River in Italy against a machine gun nest that basically was tantamount to suicide. Finally, one of the Mexican Americans refused, and he was court-martialed, and he was exonerated, right? He was declared innocent in saying that they were unnecessarily being thrown in harm's way by what seemed to be a racist military commander. All right, so you have that. Now, did you have a handful who received medals? Yes, but very few, very few. All right. So you have here Guy Gabaldon. He used his knowledge of the Japanese language to get I can't remember how many, like I guess almost 1,000 prisoners, Japanese prisoners, to come out with their hands up at Saipan. Macario Garcia, okay, a Mexican immigrant who stormed machine gun nest while wounded and earned the moniker the Daring Mexican, earned some of our nation's highest medals of honor, right? But then at this time, right, there was a young man, and I think I have his name here somewhere. I'm trying to remember his darn name. But there was a Mexican American in Texas who died, who gave his life in the Philippines, right? And in doing so, they refused to honor him back in his hometown in Texas and putting him in a military cemetery to lay to rest. Felix Longoria was his name. And so it made the news that he was not allowed to be brought into um, a veteran cemetery. And a young Lyndon B. Johnson, who became president, right, during the civil rights era from 64 to 68, Lyndon B. Johnson arranged for him to be brought to Washington, D.C., but not until there was a lot of anger over Felix Longoria's rejection into that cemetery. Then you also had the Zoot Suit riots. And with the Zoot Suit riots, you had a guy named Hank Levas and his friends. They went to a pool party, and a young man was killed. They were put on trial. They had nothing but circumstantial evidence, but nevertheless, they arrested them and convicted them, nevertheless. And then I kid you not, according to the documentary, a few years later, one of the girlfriends comes forth with evidence that her brother had killed this young man. And so hence exonerating the Hank Levas's crew. They really weren't guilty of killing him. His name was Jose Diaz. And the reason why the girlfriend finally had come out is because her brother had subsequently been murdered himself. So what could they do to him now? So at any rate, right, they had this stereotype against Pachucos, against these kind of like Mexican cholos, if you will, in Southern California. And with the Zoot Suit riots, while that controversial, thing was going on, there were some U.S. sailors. They traveled into East LA for the nightlife, and East LA had a lot of Hispanics. And supposedly, some of the local Hispanic Pachuco young men started whistling and catcalling to one of the girlfriends, and a fist fight ensued. And the Pachuco broke the naval cadet's jaw. When he went back to the ship, people had seen what happened and they wanted revenge. So you had military guys coming all the way from Reno and Las Vegas into LA to fight Pachucos, and they were known as the Zoot Suit Riots. And in the cases of them beating them up, they would strip them to humiliate them to their underwear, and they would burn their zoot suit that was symbolic of their Pachuco, persona. They'd burn their suit, their zoot suits in the middle of the street. All right. So plenty of stuff going on as far as us supposedly fighting for the reasons articulated in the Atlantic Charter for the dignity of every individual. And then, of course, the Japanese. Okay. Executive Order 9066. What happened, right? And I am in no ways condoning Executive Order 9066 at all. But what happened was the Japanese put 30,000 soldiers on the Aleutian Islands just off of Alaska and made it to appear as if they might attack the West Coast. Also, there were balloon bombs that were sent across the Pacific and exploded. One of which in Oregon killed a teacher and a handful of her young students. And then in addition to that, they captured a prisoner of war who had a map of the American West in his backpack with arrows and insignia that suggested a plan of attacking the West Coast. Then in addition to that, you did have a couple infamous Japanese nationals in Hawaii who had been giving the logistics, the exact spots of all of the American destroyers that were at bay there in Pearl Harbor. And so news got out that there was espionage. Japanese were there in Hawaii helping to make this happen and so forth. They would give their clues like with mirrors. They would have the sun hit off the mirror to a certain target, etc. They had it down to a little science, a little codified science. But they were a handful of people. They're a small handful of people. But because of this and because Pearl Harbor, right, as you may know, when they attacked, uh, not quite an hour or two later, the Japanese diplomats came with a declaration of war. So they attacked us before declaring it, which we saw as to be very, very deceitful and against international law. So there was a phobia that rose up that we cannot trust Japanese immigrants in the U.S., right? The Issei, ISEI, nor their children who were technically Japanese Americans, the Nisei, NEISI. So, I'm sorry, I probably misspelled that, but anyway, it's in here somewhere. Um, so, in the case of Washington State, they said you have so many hours to leave your home and report to this certain area and and bring only that which you can carry. So there's a good book called All That We Could Carry on the Japanese internment. So they'd show up in these camps, right? And they were given this questionnaire. And of course, right, it was very just I don't know what adjective I would use, but it's just so basic and dramatic. Uh, where's your loyalty? Would you be willing to fight against Japanese soldiers if you were drafted? Um, do you engage in the emperor's calisthenics? The emperor's calisthenics they would do as a regular exercise some Japanese Americans and their parents, and then at the end give like a salute to Hirohito. So those who gave the wrong answers, and by the way, a lot of people believe that those who gave the wrong answers, they weren't genuine, oftentimes, and that they really were for Japan against us, but they were angry, and so they responded in anger to the questionnaire. But those who had that were sent to a specifically notorious camp in Tulare, and they were known as the troublemakers. So they had a small symbolic boycott and protest in the cafeteria. And the second time it happened outside, and there was physical violence against some of the U.S. guards, and they shot into the crowd and killed two or three of them. So they technically two or three uh, internees of these camps were shot and killed, and it was at Tulare. Um, then you had some of the elderly who died of natural causes, and they believe firmly to this day that if they'd had quicker and better access to medical help, their lives could have been saved. Okay. And those who gave the right answers, showing their loyalty to the country, they were put into Japanese American regiments. And the 42nd Regiment, I'm sorry, the 442nd Regiment, the 442nd Regiment of Japanese Americans to this day is the most highly decorated regiment in American military history. And of course, they weren't trusted most of the time to fight in Asia against the Japanese. Most of the time, they were sent to Europe to fight Nazi Germany. And of course, you had your exceptions who were to help out with their knowledge of the Japanese language, the knowledge of the Japanese terrain. Okay. And there is a great book called Strangers from a Different Shore or a Distant Shore by Ronald Takaki. And it has great information on this with the Japanese during World War II. So at any rate, I conclude by saying, you know what? The uh, the reason for which we fought by virtue of how we treated our people of color was simply a lesser evil than the fascist countries. It was simply a lesser evil at best. And by the way, this picture of these two black women riveting the jet wings, a lot of Rosie the Riveters, despite the popular picture of the brunette white woman flexing her muscle, a lot of them were black. A lot of black women came from the South, moved into Richmond and Oakland, and received higher pay than they could have received down in the South. But they were rejected in the local restaurants and theaters, some apartment complexes they were not welcome to. Then there was white flight of white people leaving Richmond and Oakland on account of the arrival of so many black people. There is a historian named Limke Santangelo, and she has a book called Abiding Courage that's just on this topic. In fact, that picture that I have there, I believe, is on the cover of her book. All right. So are there any questions?
No.
All right. Well, let me get your names down to give you your proper extra credit. I appreciate you guys coming faithfully.
Last week I tried to join and it wouldn't let me at all. And then I tried the way you told me and it kept kicking me out. And so I just, after like the 10th try, I just gave up.
All right, Fernando. Well, I'll tell you what, then on the previous assignment, I'll give you extra credit. I believe you. I've had the worst luck. Yeah. I mean, for years now, literally for years, I've been able to do it just very simply on the home page. And for some reason this year, it is just something is anomalously, newly difficult. As you may recall, it's trying to make me pay to get a new innovative version of the program. Um, it'll just cut me off when I refuse to pay more money for it. And yeah, it's been crazy. Now
Yeah,
I've
I spoke.
always been able to use the homepage Zoom. And now as we use that other thing, yeah, this is a first for me.
Yeah, I spoke to a few other students like Maribel and other people, and they also said they had a few problems. So I thought I was the only one, but then
Uh,
I quickly found out that it was multiple students that
sure.
that
I'll
might
tell
have
you
the
what,
same problem.
for all four of you, um, I'm writing down to give you extra credit on your previous assignment as well.
Thank you.
All right. No, not a problem. I apologize. And I thank you for your perseverance and hanging through all these difficulties. But I hope I was of some help today. I know I'm a history nerd, but what a cool topic, World War II. Yeah. So I hope that you don't regret being a part of the Zoom today.
I appreciate the help.
All right, great. I appreciate you guys' attendance.
Thank you.
All right, you're very welcome. All right, so you guys have a good week, okay?
All
Um,
right,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thank
I
you,
have
you too.
a
Bye-bye.
question
Thank you.
regarding the upcoming test.
Yeah.
Will we be given a second attempt or not? Because I know for this third one we weren't given any attempts, like a second attempt or anything, just the very first one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, normally the second and the third and fourth tests, um, I by that time I just have you take it once. Um, but I'm okay with giving you two attempts on test four. So
I
I'll tell
really
you what,
appreciate it.
I'll go to properties and change that, okay?
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome, Elizabeth. All right. Any other questions? All right, you guys take care, okay?
Thank
All
you. Have a
right.
good day.
All right.
Thank
You
Thank
too.
you.
you.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.